I want to tell you, when I was an undergraduate in the Washington, D.C. area, we had a hapless basketball team which played on our campus in a ratty, capital R, ratty gymnasium. And I recall many times venturing across the old parking lot, which is now, a Manhattan-like center of skyscrapers, and heading over for the Saturday afternoon game. I'm going to tell you right now, it was a real inspiration on those many times when I got over there for me and my fellow undergraduates, and especially all of us philosophy majors, to see an avid and devoted fan of the Georgetown Hoyas before they were any good, and that was George Will. Give him a hand.
I grew up a Cub fan, so I'm used to rooting for teams that weren't any good for a long time.
So if any of you have not yet seen the book or bought the book or read the book, I'll tell you it's like 10 50-page George Will columns, a feast to be enjoyed, and really to add to your ongoing education. Those 10 50-page columns cover culture, the founders, the progressives, how the progressives involve themselves in the institutions of democracy, education, the economy, and I think there's a sort of a conclusion that comes with a sense of a usable conservatism.
I hope.
With also a stop on foreign policy. So let me ask you about the book, Dr. Professor Will. He was a professor this year up at Princeton. When you see in our civic life our president, and I'm not making any comment, favorable or not, about this president, just any recent president, and you see, for instance, folks from the other party, and I'm not making a comment about Democrats or Republicans, just the party out of power, and you're watching them maybe on TV, since you work in the TV business somewhat. Do you have hope?
I do. Looking on the bright side, as I am normally disinclined to do, I think the physics of our politics is working. That is, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. And I think what you're seeing today is that under both parties, Congress under both parties has been shedding its powers promiscuously and illegitimately to presidents of both parties, to a point where I think we're beginning to see Congress, signs of intelligent life in Congress, signs that they are tired of giving to presidents the power to impose taxes in the form of tariffs without Congress being involved, presidents being able to go to war without Congress being involved. The last time Congress declared war was June 5th, 1942, when we declared war on Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria as part of the tidying up the legal niceties of World War II. Yet there have been many wars since, and Congress is never involved in any meaningful way that the founders had in mind. We see presidents of both parties taking money appropriated for one purpose and repurposing it to something else. I think Americans and generally are feeling that the presidency has become too swollen, too untethered from public control, that Congress has suffered a consequent and simultaneous decline in its responsibilities and its muscles. And I think there's going to be a reaction that will take us back to where Congress is as it is in the Constitution. Article 1, the president's duties as defined in Article 2 are to take care that the laws are faithfully executed, which makes the president definitionally secondary to the lawmakers. And so I'm hopeful that we're going to see a readjusting of the great constitutional equilibrium created in our three branches by James Madison.
Is that readjustment to an equilibrium point possible when, say, one party, whichever one it might be, is so apt to what mathematicians call an absolute maximum, or maybe a local maximum, of ideological purity and sort of creedal conformity,
Well,
whether it's Republican or Democrat?
Yeah. Well, first of all, people say nothing gets done in Washington because of gridlock. Let me say that gridlock is not an American problem as much as it is an American achievement. That is, billions of people around the world wish they lived under governments that were capable of being gridlocked. Second, when our founders went to Philadelphia in the sweltering summer of 1787, they did not go to create an efficient government. They wanted to create a government strong enough to protect our rights, but not so strong as to threaten them. That is, the most important word in the Declaration of Independence is a verb, secure. Governments are instituted to secure our rights, not to give us our rights. First come rights, then comes government. So they designed a government with three branches of government, two branches of the legislative branch. Each of those two branches has a different electoral constituencies and different electoral rhythms. Vetoes, veto overrides, supermajorities, judicial review, all kinds of ways of slowing the beast down. But
I got a new mic for you.
for me,
Oh,
well, why don't I just hold it?
there you go.
All right? Is that better? Okay. All kinds of ways of slowing it down. Yet I can think of nothing the American people have wanted intensely and protractedly that they have not got. Even under the so-called gridlock of the Obama years, we had the biggest, most dramatic increase in regulation of the financial sector of our lives in Dodd-Frank since the 1930s. And with the Affordable Care Act, the largest expansion of the welfare state since 1965 with Medicare and Medicaid. So the idea that nothing's getting done is, it seems to me, a mistake. What we do, the founders did not want to make it easy to pass laws. George Washington famously said the Senate is like the saucer into which we pour our tea in order to cool. The founders said, and Madison particularly said, majorities are going to rule, but we want public opinion to be filtered and refined and passed through institutions, representative institutions, so that we don't have direct democracy, we have what he called mitigated democracy, and in fact it works.
And are you encouraged by the apparent interest of the Supreme Court in questioning the extent to which Congress has delegated authority, say through the Administrative Procedure Act and all of the subsequent developments in the area of administrative law and the administrative state?
Yes, there was a highly technical Supreme Court opinion last week, one that promises that soon there will be, when the next case comes, there will be 5 justices in favor of saying Congress has no right to divest itself of its legislative responsibilities. The first substantive words of the Constitution, that is, the first words after the preamble, are that all legislative power herein granted is vested in the Constitution of the United States. The one great mistake Madison made, and he could not have anticipated the evolution of our society and the government we have, he said, under popular government, all power is sucked into the legislative vortex, sucked into Congress. Actually, the reverse has been the case. Congress, under both parties, for more than 80 years, has been spinning off parties' powers.
We're getting a lot of microphones.
But anyway, it does seem to me that as I say, the equilibrium in our government is being restored. The real question is, how did the equilibrium get thrown away? And that is because the progressives were admirably forthright and amazingly successful in opposing the founders in the founders' vision at the beginning of the 20th century. Woodrow Wilson, elected in 1912, became the first president to criticize the American founding, which he did not do peripherally. He did it root and branch. He said, first of all, the natural rights doctrine is wrong. Wilson said, don't read the first two paragraphs of the Declaration. They'll just confuse you. It's only 4th of July rhetoric, he said, because he wanted the idea not that rights precede government, but government gives us our rights. Then he said, the separation of powers was all right long ago when we were only 4 million Americans, 80% of us living within 20 miles of Atlantic tidewater. But now, he said, we're a great nation united by steel rails and copper wires, and we need a nimble government headed by a strong president, free to act because Congress has been marginalized, and with an administrative state. Woodrow Wilson really invented the academic field of public administration. With the administrative state, we can apply science to society. Science was in the air at that time, literally in the air. The Wright brothers, Marconi, Ford, Edison, and a great confidence that society could be manipulated by government from above applying science. The great non sequitur, my judgment of the progressives, was that they said, the more complicated society gets, the more government must intervene in regulating it and determining the allocation of wealth and opportunity. That is the reverse of the case. The more complicated society gets, the less government knows relative to what there is to be known, and therefore modesty is incumbent upon the government to allow the market forces. Markets, after all, are information-generating devices, as millions of Americans make billions of decisions a day, and let markets allocate wealth and opportunity rather than the personal power of politics.
I want to go to the progressives again, and I understand your point, and it's certainly throughout the book, about the divergence they took from the founders' vision. But now let's give them their best day. Their best day. On their best day, what were they thinking then? We can all have ideas about what they're thinking now, but what were they thinking then would happen to the rights of man?
Well, last night I was speaking in San Francisco at the Commonwealth Club, and I reminded them that on September 23rd, 1932, candidate Franklin Roosevelt gave a speech there in which he said, government is a contract. The people give the government power, and the government in exchange accords them their rights. Now, the idea that our rights come from government is inimical to everything that the founders had in mind. But it was what, again, the progressives cannot be faulted for lack of candor. They were quite forthright in their rejection of the founders.
So their view was the rights which had been held as eternal or as immutable aspects of human nature would become subject to legislative majorities?
But you just said the magic phrase, that is, an immutable human nature. And they rejected the concept of an immutable human nature. And once you do that, government has an enormous temptation. If human beings have no inherent stable nature, if human beings are only creatures that adapt to whatever culture in which they're situated, then government can say, well, if we sufficiently are clever in manipulating the culture, we can shape a new kind of person. And suddenly the mission of government becomes enormous, and the temptation of government to try and fine-tune life in order to fine-tune human nature, this plastic thing, becomes tremendous, and government, well, that way leads to totalitarianism, the great belief in making new Soviet man, new German man, new this and that, instead of accommodating, as the founders wanted, the constancies of human nature.
So again, giving them their best day after the 20th century, which we all know from Yale and the Black Book of Lost Lives Under Communism, we all understand that in the 20th century, the mechanisms of government and the mechanisms of murder combined so that literally more than 100 million people were wiped out. How is it possible for folks to adhere to that view now?
I don't want to tar the progressives in America with the idea that they are incipient totalitarians. They're not. I mean, we are not a nation divided in that way. We have humane, decent differences of opinion, and we can all live together with one another. I think it's important to understand what the conservatives are saying. Conservatives in Europe existed to defend established orders and hierarchies and institutions. Conservatives in the United States want to conserve the American founding, but they want to do so in order to keep an open society, lightly governed, so that dynamism can give people an absolutely open future. It's a paradox of a sort that conservatives want to conserve the possibility of perpetual change. Is this coming through all right back there? No. My goodness.
Sound person.
Sound person is coming up with a new mic.
I'll take his. How's that?
Yeah.
Thanks for...
See, I think a wise person has said that the Bible can be reduced to one sentence. God created man and woman and promptly lost control of events. American conservatives find the lack of control exhilarating. They find change exciting. They say that the fecundity of freedom, the enormous creativity of a free society, working through free markets, is such that we should welcome uncertainty and lack of control. The progressive impulse is to say that a complicated society should be regulated and controlled by applied science. To go back to Woodrow Wilson, if you wanted to get an advanced degree in the second half of the 19th century, you generally went to Germany because American institutions of higher education had not yet begun developing graduate schools. And Americans would go to Germany and they would become very impressed with the Bismarckian state and its bureaucracy. And then they came back, some of them to Johns Hopkins, which had one of the first graduate programs where they taught one of their first graduate students, Thomas Woodrow Wilson, from a Princeton University undergraduate. And as a result of this, Woodrow Wilson began to invent the field of public administration, and we had suddenly a party of large, confident, scientifically based government. Now, if you're happy with this, the government we have today, A, you're probably mistaken, and B, you're certainly out of step with most Americans. In 1964, when I cast my first presidential vote for Barry Goldwater, I know he lost 44 states, but I like to say he actually won. It just took 16 years to count the votes. In 1964, 77% of the American people said they trusted the government to do the right thing all the time or almost all the time. 77%. Today, the figure is 17%. That's a 60-point collapse. As the pretenses of government have grown, the prestige of government has collapsed. And this should, it seems to me, concern my progressive friends very much, because the entire progressive agenda depends upon strong government. And strong government depends on public confidence in the government. So progressives and conservatives should be at one in understanding that there are lessons to be learned about the crisis of confidence in our government.
Let's go for a second to Lincoln, for whom you have special reverence, not just as an Illinoisan, but as a thinker and a writer. And I wonder if you can locate his contribution to the founding and its, and I hesitate to use the wrong word here, its elaboration, its interpretation, its application to the events of the Civil War.
I grew up in Champaign-Urbana, Illinois, where my father was a professor at the university, professor of philosophy. According to local lore, Lincoln, traveling the circuit as a very prosperous and able railroad lawyer, was in the Champaign County Courthouse in 1854 when he learned of the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Stephen A. Douglas, the Illinois senator, had passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act ostensibly to answer and settle the vexing question of what to do about the question of expanding slavery into the territories. Stephen A. Douglas said, "We will solve it with popular sovereignty in the territories. Vote slavery up, vote slavery down, it's a matter of indifference. The important thing," said Stephen A. Douglas, "was that majorities should rule." Abraham Lincoln's implacable, canny, unrelenting reaction against this doctrine of popular sovereignty launched him on what I believed was the greatest career in the history of world politics. The question for Lincoln was, is America about a process, majority rule, or is it about a condition, liberty? And he said, majorities, where the government acts, majorities should rule, but government shouldn't act everywhere. And there are certain things beyond the reach of majorities. That's a phrase from the 1943 decision in which the Supreme Court, reversing itself after just 3 years, reversed the decision in which it had said it is all right for the state governments to compel Jehovah's Witness children to salute the flag, even though doing so violated their most basic beliefs. Reversing that decision, Justice Jackson, who went on to be the lead American judge at the Nuremberg war crimes trials, Justice Jackson said, "The very purpose of a Bill of Rights is to place certain things beyond the reach of majorities, above and beyond the vicissitudes of politics." My book has a chapter in there called The Judicial Supervision of Democracy, in which I say my fellow conservatives have mistakenly advocated judicial deference to the legislative branch, judicial deference to majorities. Too many of my conservative friends have decided that the counter-majoritarian dilemma exists, that we shouldn't have judicial review, that judicial review is an anomaly in a majoritarian society. I believe that judicial deference often is dereliction of judicial duty. To have a written constitution, as John Marshall understood, and I argue in the book that he's the third most important American after Lincoln and Washington. If you're going to have a written constitution, you have to have a mechanism for laying the acts of Congress next to the Constitution, and when they are discordant, preferring the Constitution and overturning the acts of the legislature. So that some of us now advocate judicial engagement rather than judicial modesty and judicial restraint.
Let's get out of the courthouse for a second. I want to ask you about the big institution of American democracy. Okay, so here at the Union League Club, we're very proud of using these windows to look outside and to see what's happening in the city. So we have something like 14 boys and girls clubs. There are 13,000 kids, George, who are in our boys and girls clubs, and we have a farm in Wisconsin, which is a camp. We give, because of the art, we give scholarships to young people. We have engineering scholarships, and so we're very involved in what's happening out here. It's part of who we are and what distinguishes us from other downtown clubs, and they're great, and we like how we are. But in this big activity of American democracy, and if you put governing up there next to it, you've got a lot of actions, a lot of decisions being made on a daily basis. Whether it's a school board or the United States Senate looking at a new nominee for the Supreme Court, it's a big tapestry. In that tapestry, what worries you the most?
Two things worry me the most. One is that big government will be like a huge shade tree in the shade of which smaller institutions cannot grow and flourish. Institutions like this one. When society decides that everything must be done through the government, and that private charity even is an anomaly, and now the government ought to take care of these things, then the enormously rich voluntary associations that make civil society function, that de Tocqueville marveled at when he visited the United States in the Jacksonian era, those institutions begin to wither and die, leaving no institutions to mediate between the state and the individual. That's one thing that worries me. But two other worries I have, and I'm really a virtuoso worrier. No one ever wrote political philosophy because they were content. Isn't it wonderful? I think I'll write a book. Two things worry me. One is family disintegration. The family is the primary transmitter of social capital. That is, the habits, mores, customs, dispositions that enable people to make good use of freedom and the opportunities of a free society. Today, 40% of all American first births are out of wedlock. Listen to this number. A majority of American mothers under 30 are not living with the fathers of their children. Now, what that means is a constantly renewed cohort of adolescent males without fathers in the home. Now, I've raised 3 boys, and I know that the whole purpose of civilization is to civilize adolescent boys. And when you don't have that, you have chaos. You have chaotic neighborhoods, and you have schools that are so busy maintaining discipline that they cannot teach. That's one of my worries. I've already talked about an earlier worry, the disequilibrium between our institutions, but there's a third thing. For all the talk about the discord in America today, and Lord knows it's real enough, I am much more frightened of a consensus that is as broad as the Republic and as deep as the Grand Canyon and extends from Elizabeth Warren on the left to Ted Cruz on the right. And the consensus is this: we should have a large, generous welfare state and not pay for it. Everyone's agreed on that. I believe the American political class, again from Warren to Cruz, is more united by its class interest than it is divided by ideology. And its class interest is in giving the American people $1 worth of government and charging them 80 cents for it, borrowing 1/5 about of what the government spends. The public loves this. It makes big government cheap. We used to borrow money for the future. We fought wars for the future. We built roads and harbors and bridges and airports for the future. Now, we're borrowing money from the future, from the unborn and hence unconsenting future taxpayers, in order to finance our own current consumption of government goods and services. And if that isn't decadent democracy, I don't know what is.
On that cheerful note, we're going to ask Brian and Kathy, they're going to grab their microphones and go around. And while they're getting out there, if you've got a question, wave to one of them, and they're going to work their way around, and then we'll get into that part. Let me do some rapid fire. George, the tinny arf of George Bush. What got you about George Bush so much? This is George H.W.
Well, what got me were some speeches he made while vice president. There's something about the vice presidential office that isn't good for the dignity of the individual. And he gave some speeches in which he attacked certain people, Mario Cuomo of New York and others, ascribing to them things they just hadn't said. And it's part of the job of people in my business to try and police that kind of inaccuracy.
And people seem to think you're not a big fan of President Trump.
Well, I was recently on the Bill Maher show, and he said, George, President Trump's name doesn't appear in your book. And I said, neither does the name of Doris Day. This is a book about ideas, and that's...
Brian's right here on your left.
I'm Charles Waters. I'm a retired social service worker. My question is this: do you think anybody will run against Donald Trump on the Republican side?
No. Well, that's not fair. There is someone running, and it's Bill Weld. Bill was a 2-term governor of Massachusetts, so he's a serious man. He's read Friedrich Hayek and some of the other people who figure largely in my book. He's extremely intelligent and very funny, and rich as God, frankly. His family has been here about as long as anyone's been here. In fact, someone once said, "Bill, is it true your family came over on the Mayflower?" And he said, "No, actually, we sent the servants over on the Mayflower to get the cottage ready." Bill is running, but the Republican Party, and I mean this quite seriously, is more homogenous, less ideologically diverse today than it has ever been in its history. The Republican Party was divided in 1912 when Teddy Roosevelt, who wanted the presidency back, ran against his protege and friend, the incumbent president, William Howard Taft. In the 1940s, Bob Taft, the senator from Ohio, and Dewey, the governor of New York, illustrated the liberal-conservative tension in the Republican Party. In 1960s, it was the Goldwater Republicans against the Rockefeller Republicans. Today, the Republican Party has no dissent in it. At the 500-day mark of the Reagan presidency, he had the support of 77% of Republicans. At the 500-day mark of the Trump presidency, he had the support of 87% of Republicans, and I think it's higher today. So we can argue about why this is and what it means, but there it is. It is a fact, I think.
Kathy? Kathy's getting her mic on.
It's a mic day here.
Hi, my name is Kent Lawrence. I'm a member of the Union League. And following up on that question and just trying to drill down and really get for real, disregarding the language and style of President Trump and focusing entirely upon actions taken, including judicial appointments, confirmed or not, and regulatory pruning, et cetera, and foreign affairs, who, if any, do you think would have done a better job over the last 2.5 years, Republican or Democrat, and in 2020 would do a better job, in your opinion, Republican or Democrat, and why?
I'm afraid you load the question when you say disregarding all that other stuff. Any Republican president would have cut the corporate tax rate. Barack Obama wanted to cut the corporate tax rate. Any Republican president would have a deregulatory agenda. Any Republican president would have taken his judicial appointments from lists vetted by the likes of the Federalist Society, of which I am a card-carrying member. The problem is you cannot disregard. I hate to bring up Voldemort, who shall not be named, but you cannot disregard the coarsening of our rhetoric and our public life. I believe, and have so written, that the damage done by the lying, I have to say it, and the name-calling, the kind of third-grade behavior that we'd all send our children to bed without dessert if they did what the president is doing, will have a longer effect and a more damaging effect than Nixon's surreptitious burglaries and crimes had, because they were at least surreptitious, and once revealed, they were punished and cleaned up, and we moved on. You cannot unring a bell, and you cannot have 4 years of this kind of name-calling and childishness and dishonesty without it having an effect. Now, maybe once the next president comes in and whoever he or she is says, everybody calm down, and remembers the penultimate paragraph of Lincoln's first inaugural address, which began, "We are not enemies, we must not be enemies." He was addressing a nation in which 7 states had already voted to leave the Union. Perhaps we can snap back to a more civilized kind of discourse. But I'm telling you, when a president overseas approvingly quotes the most odious dictator on the planet, the head of North Korea, approvingly quotes him as saying of a former vice president of the United States that he is a low-voltage idiot, and says, I agree with the head of North Korea, something has gone terribly wrong in our civic discourse.
Hi, my name is Kevin Silverman. My question is, if for whatever reason Mr. Trump is unable to run, who do you think would be a good Republican candidate? And if that's too hypothetical, who do you think should run in 2024?
Well, the current president has cured me of presidential fastidiousness. You know, I used to say, oh, I don't like him because he's wrong on this. And, you know, anybody, come on, just come forward. There are so many good people in Washington on the Republican side. Pat Toomey, Rob Portman, Ben Sass of Nebraska. Bill Weld would be fine. I voted for Ben Sass in 2016. I wrote him in. So there's a lot of talent out there. And a lot of people who you see, I do not think the American people are angry. I think the people watching MSNBC are angry and the people watching Fox are angry, and I work for both of them. But there are 327 million people in this country, and at any given moment, 320 million plus are not watching cable television and are not listening to talk radio. They're fixing the screen door and washing the car and raising children and getting on with their lives. I think the Democrats make a huge mistake if they think the country is as angry as some of them are. I don't think the American people want transformation. I think they want restoration of something like normality. I think the American people, far from being angry, are sad, embarrassed, and exhausted. They're sad because they're embarrassed. They're sad because they're embarrassed, and they find the whole circus exhausting. And if the Democrats are wise, and they are world's oldest political party and world's greatest political party, just look what they've taken our country through, wars, depressions, all the rest, they will recognize this and give the country restoration.
One
Kathy and
question
Sheila.
back here.
Yeah, Sheila Weinberg, sorry, you're holding me. That's okay. Sheila Weinberg, founder and CEO of Truth in Accounting. We work to get governments to tell us the truth about their finances. Because we believe that our representative forms of government are at risk because the people are actually misinformed when they go to vote. You mentioned that the government is continually borrowing. Our number is that the true debt is over $100 trillion. Will the government, the question is will the government continue to borrow, and when will that result in a crisis, or will they come to a census before that crisis happens? And if it is going to be a crisis, what does that crisis look like? The first thing I wanted to mention that I forgot is that if the Union League Club, we're always looking for membership. So I'm part of the Public Affairs Committee, so I'm advertising that if you enjoy this program, audience, feel free to join the club.
Plug. That's a
Excellent.
naked plug. Thank you, Sheila. Now back to George Will.
I'm tempted to join the club, and I don't even live here just because it's so brilliant. Let me address your question. We are now today going to run a $1 trillion deficit, at full employment, actually more than full employment. There are about 6 million unfilled jobs, and at reasonable economic growth. Imagine when the next recession begins and we start with a $1 trillion deficit, and we start with low interest rates so the Federal Reserve can't, in a counter-cyclical move, cut interest rates very much. Now, some people say, well, we're not going to have any more recessions. My feeling is that if the current president had abolished the business cycle, his native modesty would not have prevented him from mentioning it. So it's a terrifying thought. But again, both parties are equally culpable. Indeed, as I say in this book, the deficits are generally worse under Republican administrations. I don't know why, but those are the facts. And your question is a good one. Are we going to wake up? I doubt it. I think democracies very often are so complacent and so content that they only act on difficult questions under the lash of necessity. In the 1930s, the American people agreed to change the relationship of the citizen to the central government under the New Deal because they were frightened. They thought they might be consigned to permanent depression. In the 1930s, the British listened to Churchill talk, but they didn't really hear him. They didn't pay attention until Hitler got to the Channel ports. Then they brought him to power. So generally, democracies act decisively only when they have no other choice. And the question is, if we have a real crisis in our public finances and people are frightened, they don't always make good choices when frightened. That's what is coming down the road at us.
Brian?
Mike. Mr. Will, I read your column all the time in the Tribune, and I have one question. I think you're a very reasonable person. What I see is the Democratic Party going way too far to the left. They're appealing to everyone who is a minority in any way they can find one, they pull them in. I see the Republican Party often going too far to the right. My belief is we are at that time where we need a third political party, a moderate party, which I believe you would probably be part of because we believe in American values and we don't believe in extremism. So I'll just listen to your comments.
My comment is this. I carry in my wallet a little card in which I write down everything the Democrats have endorsed that most Americans consider a bit weird. And I'm going to need a bigger card. They want to pack the Supreme Court, abolish the Electoral College, abolish private health insurance, reparations for slavery. Elizabeth Warren now wants reparations for same-sex couples because until the Supreme Court ruled on same-sex marriages, they couldn't file joint tax returns, so they're owed $50 billion. Forgive all student loans, including those of the children of the upper middle class, and forgiveness that would be financed by an American majority that does not have four-year college degrees. Green New Deal, which in its own explanatory papers they put out means we aspire to get rid of meat and airplanes, and terrorists in federal prison, including the Boston Marathon bomber, should be allowed to vote. Now that's a little card, and it's got all those on it. And what's the Republican Party offer in exchange? A kind of cult of personality. This is not an optimum moment in our national history.
Brian, we have a question over here. Sir?
Yes, thank you. Mr. Will, thank you for coming. I'm a member of the Union League Club for more than years, and I will admit. But I'm delighted that you've come, especially into a state that is well known for its Democratic following.
I was in San Francisco last night. You have no idea.
My question is more on presidential powers, and if you can envision this as a possibility. Years ago, Americans said 4 terms of Franklin Delano Roosevelt or any president is too much. We're cutting it back to 2 years. What would prohibit us in the next 4 years to eliminate the 22nd Amendment and make presidents long-term or run as long as they want to? Is there something that stops that?
No, you'd have to amend the Constitution, which is hard to do. I am a firm believer in term limits for national legislators so that they will think of the next generation, not the next election. But the problem is, in 1994, the Supreme Court, in another 5-4 decision, again with the crucial vote being Justice Kennedy at the time, ruled that you cannot do, as some states had tried to do, to limit the number of terms their senators and congressmen could serve by statute. They said this requires a constitutional amendment, and Congress is never going to send to the states for ratification a constitutional amendment limiting their ability to have long careers in Congress. Therefore, it would take a president committed to term limits to try and move the country and shame Congress into going along with it. Interestingly, Beto O'Rourke, running for the Democratic nomination, has come out for term limits. But I don't think Beto O'Rourke's going to be the 46th president.
Brian.
Mr. Will, my name's Robert Johnson. Sorry. I'm Robert Johnson. And if we start with the premise that federalism is out of tilt, and partly, if you also assume partly that the direct election of senators, that amendment was repealed and gave more attention back to the states, and two other amendments with regard to the rights of the people, I think the 9th and 10th Amendments.
Yep.
Could you address that, please?
Well, I think you're right. The states, as we have centralized power in Washington, and the progressive agenda has been more and more power in Washington, more and more Washington power in the executive branch. We have hollowed out the states and reduced them basically to administrative entities administering federal dictates from Washington. It's very hard to reverse that, but it's important to do so. One of the really great progressive thinkers, Louis Brandeis, before he became a Supreme Court justice, described states as laboratories of democracy. The simple truth is we are more apt to have one or two clever, innovative, intelligent governors than we are to have at any given time a clever, intelligent president, because you got 50 chances to have good governors. And we've seen enormous creativity on the part of various governors, environmentally, regarding welfare policy, regarding education. So the more we could reverse power and send it back to the states, the better. Now, I'm a son of this state, and I understand the problem of sending more power to Springfield, Illinois. Why don't they just cut out the middleman and send it to the south side of Chicago and give it to Madigan in the first place?
This is the second time within 8 days or 7 days. On Friday night, I saw Mick Jagger at Soldier Field, and he was talking about Ed Burke, who is a member of this club. He was talking about Ed Burke. Now I'm sitting next to George Will at the Union League Club, and he's talking about Madigan. I mean, Linda Chu, what's going on? How are we getting such prominence for these things going on in our state?
One day, I'll tell you a story. When I was, about many years ago, I was in Chicago in the Cape Cod room at the Drake, having dinner with a great Chicago writer, Saul Bellow, who began, of course, his wonderful novel, The Adventures of Augie March. I'm an American Chicago-born. And I said, you know who I'd really like to meet? But I can't get him to see me. And that is Fast Eddie Vodroliak. And Saul Bellow said, that's not a problem. Just go into his office and say you want a job in the sanitation department, and he'll see you right away. You gotta love Chicago.
There was a place at 103rd and Commercial. That's where you went on a Saturday morning. That's how you got to do it. All right, who's up?
I have a question around the corner here, Chris.
Where are you? There you are.
I consider myself a pretty patriotic person, pretty good citizen, and I found it impossible to vote in the last election for either of the candidates. Is there any chance I'm not going to have that dilemma next time?
In our long history of 50-some presidential elections, before 2016, we had never had a major candidate, not one, whose disapproval rating was higher than his approval rating going into the fall campaign. In 2016, we had 2 of them. Now, I don't know, people worry a lot and think a lot about how our nominating process did this. And there are lots of problems with the nominating process, but the fact is that was an anomaly, 2016. And there an enormous number of people felt as you did. And 77,744 votes, I believe it was, divided over 3 states, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. Just that drop in the electoral bucket in those 3 states produced the result that we got. But no one, very few people in this country would have been happy no matter who won that 2016 election. And the problem is to try and figure out ways. As I said, there are 327 million of us in this country. We can do better than the 2 we usually wind up with.
Brian.
Good evening, Mr. Will. My name is Jason Mink. I'm a history and math teacher. I heard you briefly mention the Electoral College. My question is, what is the best argument for maintaining the Electoral College?
I'm an enthusiast for the Electoral College. I think it promotes, it requires people, instead of the Democrats simply going to their coastal enclaves and running up as many votes as they can get, and the Republicans concentrating on the middle of the country, running up as much as they can get. It compels people to campaign in all regions. It compels people to build coalitions of ideological diversity. It, to refer to the previous question about federalism, by having, we do have popular vote for the president. We have 51 of them in the 50 states and the District of Columbia. It encourages us to think about the country as 50 sovereign states making decisions, so it strengthens our federalism. It has produced an amazing set of presidents over the years. It is, I think, the most successful instrument for picking a great nation's chief executive that the world has yet seen. And we should go, which I'm sure we won't, I'll tell you why in a second, if we should go to a general popular vote, pouring all the votes in the country, 140 million votes into one big pail, what happens when you have an election like 2000, when Bush and Gore were separated by so few votes, or 1960, when Kennedy beat Nixon by fewer votes than there are American precincts in this country? But what happened was the Electoral College exaggerates the decisiveness of the victory. It gave Kennedy a substantial lead in the Electoral College, and he could therefore govern effectively. We're not going to change the Electoral College. And one of the things that I find strange about the Democrats this year is they spend so much time talking about things that are not going to happen. The reason they want to get rid of the Electoral College is that because each state gets an electoral vote for its 2 senators, Wyoming has the same number of senators as California, and California has 80 times more of the population. Therefore, they say it gives unfair additional weight to the small states. Maybe you can complain about that, but 13 small states is all it will take to stop an a constitutional amendment, and they will stop it. So we're not going to change the Electoral College. But remember this, the Founding Fathers were not simple people, and they did not create a simple democracy, not just democracy by adding machine. They wanted nuance and they wanted complexity because they wanted to refine and filter public opinion and to have the states be involved and all the rest. The slogan against it, one person, one vote, all votes counting equally, is simple, but again, our founders were not simple people.
I want to ask you then a question that arose from my reading of your book, and that is, have you another example of a successful democratic republic, or one that, in whatever terms you choose, has done better than we have?
No. Look, maybe Denmark, but governing Denmark is not complicated. It's
We love Denmark.
It's small,
Denmark is wonderful.
It's a small, homogenous country. We're a continental republic with vast regional differences and enormous racial and ethnic and religious diversity. We are a complicated outfit, and we are the most roaring success the world has ever seen. People are lined up at our borders, and I won't get into that whole policy, but they're trying to get in. This is still a magnet to the world, and I want to keep it that way. And again, no one ever got rich betting against the United States.
I think George Will is a magnet to the Union League Club. And for such magnetism, here is the best that we can do, straight from Guangzhou. George Will, you will never be wanting a cup of coffee in Chicago now.
Good.
You can always come here.
Good. I'll be back.
Ladies and gentlemen, Dale.